Emma Watson woke up early every morning in her tiny cottage at the edge of Millbrook Village. The autumn wind rattled her windows as she prepared for another day at the small village school. Her meagre teacher's salary barely covered her rent and food, but Emma never complained. She loved teaching the village children, even though money was always tight. On this particular November morning, frost covered the ground like a white blanket. Emma wrapped her thin shawl round her shoulders and walked the familiar path to the schoolhouse. The air was crisp and cold, making her breath visible in small puffs as she passed the old stone church. Emma heard something unusual. Strange sounds were coming from the abandoned barn behind the building. At first, she thought it might be stray cats or perhaps some wild animals seeking shelter from the cold. But as she listened more carefully, the sounds seemed different somehow. Curiosity got the better of her. Emma had always been the type of person who couldn't ignore someone in need. She changed her direction and walked toward the weathered barn. The wooden structure had been empty for years, used only to store old church furniture and forgotten items. The heavy wooden door creaked loudly as Emma pushed it open. The inside was dark and smelled of old hay and dampness. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she gasped at what she saw. 5 children were huddled together in the corner of the barn. They sat on a pile of old blankets, their arms wrapped round each other for warmth. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and their faces were thin from hunger. The youngest appeared to be no more than 6 years old, while the oldest looked about 12. When they saw Emma, the children's eyes filled with fear. They pressed closer together, like frightened animals caught in the open. The oldest boy, with sandy brown hair and serious eyes, stepped slightly in front of the others as if to protect them. "Please don't tell anyone we're here," he whispered, urgently. His voice was hoarse and tired. "We have nowhere else to go. Please, we'll leave if you want us to, but don't tell the authorities about us." Emma's heart immediately ached for these poor children. She could see the desperation in their young faces, the way they looked at her with both hope and fear. Their clothes were much too thin for the cold weather, and she could tell they hadn't eaten a proper meal in quite some time. "What are your names?" Emma asked gently, kneeling down to their level so she wouldn't seem threatening. The oldest boy hesitated for a moment, then said, "I'm Thomas. This is my sister Mary. And these are our friends Peter, Alice, and little Ben." He pointed to each child as he spoke their names. "Where are your parents?" Emma asked softly. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, but he tried to stay strong. "They're gone. All of our parents are gone. Some got sick, others had accidents. We don't have any family left, and the orphanage in the next town is full. They told us to wait, but winter is coming and we had nowhere to stay warm." The little girl named Mary, with golden curls and big blue eyes, looked up at Emma. "Are you going to make us leave?" she asked in a tiny voice. Emma felt her heart breaking into pieces. These innocent children had lost everything and were trying to survive on their own. She looked at their thin faces and trembling hands, and she knew she couldn't walk away. Without hesitation, Emma reached into her lunch basket. She had packed herself a simple meal of bread, cheese, and an apple for the day. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She began breaking the bread into equal pieces, making sure each child received a fair share. "Here," she said warmly. "You must be hungry." The children's faces lit up with gratitude and amazement. They accepted the food with careful, reverent hands, as if it were the most precious gift in the world. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice full of emotion. "We haven't had a real meal in 3 days." Emma watched them eat and felt both sadness and determination fill her heart. These children needed help. And she was perhaps the only person who knew about their situation. She couldn't simply pretend. She hadn't found them. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised, her voice gentle but firm. "And I'll bring more food." The children looked at her with such hope and relief that Emma nearly cried. She gave them her apple as well, watching as they carefully divided it among themselves. As Emma walked to the schoolhouse that day, her mind was already working on a plan. She had very little money and barely enough food for herself. But she couldn't let these children go hungry. Her heart had already made the decision for her. She would find a way to help them, no matter what it cost her personally. That evening, Emma sat in her small cottage, planning how she could stretch her meager resources to feed 5 extra mouths. She knew it would mean sacrifices for herself, but the image of those grateful, hopeful faces made her more determined than ever. Emma's daily routine changed completely after discovering the children in the barn. Every morning, she would wake up before dawn and carefully prepare food in her small kitchen. She would make herself a tiny portion of porridge or bread, then pack the rest into a cloth bundle for the orphans. Her breakfast became smaller and smaller each day. Sometimes she would only have a cup of weak tea and a small piece of bread. She told herself that she didn't need much food, that the children needed it more than she did. But her body was beginning to show the effects of her sacrifice. Each afternoon after school, Emma would hurry to the barn with her bundle of food. The children would wait for her eagerly, their faces lighting up when they heard her footsteps. She would watch them eat with such joy and gratitude that it made her forget her own hunger. Thomas had become protective of the group, making sure the younger ones ate first. Little Mary would always save a small piece of whatever Emma brought to offer back to her, but Emma would gently refuse, saying she had already eaten plenty. As the weeks passed, Emma's appearance began to change dramatically. Her cheeks became hollow and her clothes started hanging loose on her shrinking body. The bright color in her face faded to a pale, tired look. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and her hands began to tremble slightly when she wrote on the blackboard at school. Rose Miller, Emma's closest friend and fellow teacher, was the first to notice these changes. Rose had known Emma since childhood and could see that something was wrong. One afternoon, she cornered Emma after school. Emma, "You look terrible," Rose said with concern. "You're so thin and pale. Are you eating enough? Are you sick?" Emma forced a bright smile onto her face, though it took considerable effort. "Oh, I'm just tired lately. The headmaster has been giving me extra duties with the younger children. You know how demanding they can be." Rose studied her friend's face carefully. "Are you sure that's all? You look like you've lost a lot of weight, and your hands are shaking." "I'm perfectly fine, Rose. Really?" Emma insisted, quickly hiding her trembling hands behind her back. "Just need more sleep. That's all." But Rose wasn't convinced. She watched Emma carefully over the following days, noticing how she barely touched her lunch and seemed weak during their walks together. The truth was becoming harder for Emma to hide. She was slowly starving herself to keep the 5 orphans alive. Every piece of bread she gave away was a piece she couldn't eat herself. Every apple she shared meant she would go without fruit for days. Her body was beginning to rebel against the constant hunger. She felt dizzy when she stood up too quickly, and sometimes her vision would blur during lessons, but every time she saw the children's grateful faces, every time little Mary hugged her legs in thanks, Emma felt that her sacrifice was worthwhile. As November turned colder, Emma realized that food alone wouldn't be enough. The children needed warm clothing and blankets to survive the approaching winter. Their thin, torn clothes would never protect them from the freezing temperatures that were coming. Emma looked round her modest cottage at her few precious possessions. She owned very little, But what she had was all she had left of her family. Her mother's silver necklace and matching earrings sat in a small wooden box on her dresser. These were the only valuable things she owned, gifts from parents who had died when she was young. With a heavy heart but firm determination, Emma took the jewelry to the village pawn shop. The shopkeeper gave her a small amount of money, but it was enough to buy some warm socks and a blanket for the children. Next, she sold her best dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that she wore to church on Sundays. It was beautiful and made her feel special, but the children needed warm clothes more than she needed to look pretty. Finally, Emma made the hardest decision of all. She took her own warm winter coat, the thick wool one that kept her comfortable during the coldest days, and sold it to buy mittens and scarves for the orphans. Dr. William Hayes, the village physician, encountered Emma on the street one particularly cold day. He noticed immediately that she wasn't wearing a proper coat, just a thin shawl wrapped round her shoulders. "Emma Watson," he called out, stopping her with a concerned expression. "You're not dressed warmly enough for this weather. Where is your winter coat?" Emma pulled her shawl tighter round herself, trying not to let her teeth chatter. "I'm fine, Dr. Hayes. I don't get cold easily." The doctor studied her pale, thin face and noticed how her clothes hung loosely on her frame. "Young lady, you don't look well at all. You've lost considerable weight, and you're clearly not taking proper care of yourself. You must eat more and dress more warmly." "I'm perfectly fine," Emma repeated. Though her voice was weaker than she intended, her hands were shaking visibly. Now, both from cold and from hunger. Dr. Hayes frowned deeply. "I insist you come to my office for an examination. You're clearly unwell." "Thank you, but that's not necessary," Emma said quickly, then hurried away before he could argue further. But as Emma walked home that evening, she knew the doctor was right. She was running out of strength, and winter was still approaching. Her body felt weak and tired all the time now. December arrived in Millbrook with a fury that no one had expected. The snow began falling on a Tuesday morning and didn't stop for 3 days straight. By Thursday, the entire village was buried under the deepest snow anyone could remember. The wind howled through the streets, creating drifts that reached up to the windows of houses. Emma woke up on Thursday morning to find her small cottage nearly buried. She had to push hard against her front door just to open it enough to squeeze. Outside, the cold air hit her face like a slap, and she immediately began shivering in her thin clothes. She looked toward the barn where the children were staying and felt her heart sink. The path that she usually took was completely covered with snow that came up to her knees. Walking through it would be difficult even for someone in good health. But Emma had grown so weak over the past weeks that she wasn't sure she could make it. But the thought of the 5 children waiting for her, probably cold and hungry, gave her the strength she needed to try. She wrapped her thin shawl round her head and shoulders, picked up the small bundle of food she had managed to scrape together, and stepped out into the storm. The snow was deeper than she had expected. With each step, her feet sank down almost to her knees. The cold went right through her worn shoes and thin stockings. Her legs felt heavy and tired after just a few steps, but she forced herself to keep moving forward. Emma's vision had been getting worse lately. Sometimes everything would go blurry, especially when she stood up too quickly or when she was very hungry. As she struggled through the snow, the white landscape seemed to swim in front of her eyes, making it hard to see where she was going. Halfway to the barn, Emma felt her strength giving out completely. Her legs began to shake, and she couldn't seem to catch her breath. The world around her started spinning, and suddenly she found herself falling forward into the deep snow. The cold snow hit her face like 1,000 tiny needles. For a moment, Emma just lay there, feeling the ice soaking through her clothes and chilling her to the bone. She was so tired, so very tired. Part of her wanted to just close her eyes and rest right there in the snow. But then she remembered little Mary's sweet face and Thomas trying so hard to be brave for the younger ones. She thought about Peter and Alice and baby Ben, all of them, waiting in that cold barn, counting on her to bring them food. They had no one else in the world to help them. With tremendous effort, Emma pushed her hands against the ground and tried to get up. It took her 3 tries before she could stand again. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but she picked up her bundle of food and continued walking toward the barn. When she finally reached the old wooden building, Emma could barely lift her hand to push open the door. The children heard her coming and rushed to meet her. They could see immediately that something was very wrong. "Miss Emma," little Mary cried out, her blue eyes wide with worry. "You're covered in snow, and you're shaking so much." The children gathered round Emma, trying to brush the snow off her clothes and help her sit down on one of their blankets. She was shivering so hard that she could barely speak. Thomas, who had grown wiser than his 12 years through all the hardships he had faced, looked at Emma with deep concern. He could see how thin she had become, how her cheeks had sunken in and her eyes had dark circles round them. "Miss Emma," he said gently, "you need to eat something too. You're getting too thin. We're worried about you." Emma tried to smile, but even that simple action seemed to take all her energy. "No, dear ones," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need the food more than I do. You're still growing. And you need to stay strong." She divided the small amount of food she had brought among the 5 children, making sure each one got an equal share. As always, she kept nothing for herself. Even though her stomach ached with hunger, the children ate gratefully, but they kept glancing at Emma with worried expressions. Even young Mary could see that their kind teacher was getting sicker and weaker each day. After spending some time making sure the children were as warm as possible, Emma knew she had to try to make it back home before the storm got worse. She stood up slowly, holding onto the wall for a support, and prepared to face the difficult journey back through the snow. The walk home was even harder than the trip to the barn had been. Emma's legs gave out twice, sending her tumbling into the snowdrifts. Each time, she had to rest for several minutes before she could find the strength to get back up and continue walking. By the time she finally reached her cottage, Emma was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. She collapsed onto her small bed without even removing her wet clothes, and lay there shivering and weak. That night, as the storm continued to rage outside her windows, Emma prayed with all her heart. She asked for help, for some kind of miracle that would save the children. She had given everything she could possibly give, but it wasn't enough. The children still needed more help than she could provide, and her own strength was almost completely gone. She knew she couldn't continue like this much longer. The morning after the terrible snowstorm, the sun finally came out over Millbrook Village. The snow sparkled like diamonds, but the cold air was still bitter and sharp. Emma woke up feeling weaker than she had ever felt in her life. Her head was spinning, and her legs felt like they could barely hold her up. But she knew the children would be waiting for her. They always waited, no matter how cold or hungry they were. Emma wrapped her thin shawl round her shoulders and picked up the tiny piece of bread she had saved for them. It wasn't much, but it was all she had left. As she stepped outside, Emma felt the world spinning round her. The bright white snow made everything look blurry, and she had to hold onto her door frame to keep from falling down right away. But she forced herself to start walking toward the barn. At the same time, a stranger was riding into Millbrook on horseback. James Miller was a cowboy who traveled from town to town, looking for work on farms and ranches. He was a tall man with kind eyes and wore leather boots. His horse was tired from traveling through the snow, and James was looking for a place to rest and get some hot food. As James rode slowly down the main street of the village, he noticed a woman walking unsteadily toward an old barn behind the church. Even from a distance, he could see that something was wrong. The woman was stumbling and swaying as she walked, like she might fall down at any moment. James watched with growing concern as the woman suddenly collapsed in the snow near the barn. Without hesitation, he urged his horse forward and quickly dismounted. He ran through the deep snow to where Emma had fallen. "Mom, are you all right?" James asked, kneeling down beside Emma in the snow. His voice was gentle and full of genuine worry. Emma tried to open her eyes and focus on the stranger's face. She was embarrassed to be found in such a weak state and tried to wave him away. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she clearly wasn't fine at all. "Please, just let me be." But James could see that this woman was very sick and weak. He gently helped her sit up and then supported her as she tried to stand. "Let me help you, ma'am. You don't look well." Emma was too weak to argue anymore. She allowed James to help her walk the remaining distance to the barn. When James pushed open the old wooden door, he stopped in amazement at what he saw inside. 5 children were huddled together on old blankets, their faces thin and pale from hunger. They looked up with frightened eyes when they saw the stranger. But they immediately rushed to Emma's side when they saw how weak she was. "Miss Emma, little," Mary cried, taking Emma's cold hand in both of hers. "You fell down again, didn't you?" Thomas looked at James with suspicious eyes, stepping protectively in front of the younger children. "Who are you? What do you want?" James looked round the barn, taking in the scene before him. He saw the thin, hungry children, the woman who could barely stand, and the tiny piece of bread in Emma's hand. In that moment, he understood everything. This kind woman had been starving herself to feed these orphan children. Without saying a word, James helped Emma sit down on one of the blankets. He pulled a metal canteen from his belt and offered her some water. Emma drank gratefully, the cool liquid helping to clear her head a little. "I'll be right back," James said quietly, and then he left the barn. The children gathered round Emma, worried about both her condition and the stranger who had found them. Emma tried to reassure them, but she was too weak to say much. They all waited nervously, wondering what would happen next. 2 hours later, James returned to the barn, but this time he wasn't alone. He was carrying several large bags and had asked 2 men from the village to help him bring everything to the barn. The bags were filled with fresh bread, cheese, apples, warm soup in containers, and even some candy for the children. He had also bought thick wool blankets, warm clothes in different sizes, and medicine that the village doctor had recommended for people who hadn't been eating enough food. Emma stared at all the supplies with tears in her eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I cannot repay you for this kindness. I have no money, nothing of value to give you." James smiled warmly and knelt down beside her. "Ma'am, some things in life aren't about getting paid back. Sometimes we help because it's simply the right thing to do. When I see people in need, and I have the ability to help them, that's what I choose to do." James had spent nearly all the money he had saved from his travels, but he didn't regret it for even a moment. He built a warm fire in an old metal container, being careful to make sure the smoke could escape through a hole in the barn roof. For the first time in many weeks, Emma ate a full meal. The warm soup and fresh bread made her feel stronger almost immediately. The children laughed and played as they ate. their faces bright with joy and relief. Little Peter, who rarely spoke, looked up at James with wonder. "Are you an angel?" he asked innocently. James chuckled and ruffled the boy's hair. "No, son. I'm just a cowboy who believes in helping folks when they need it." Thomas, still trying to understand this stranger's kindness, asked, "Why are you being so kind to us? We're nobody special." James looked round at all their faces, Emma's grateful tears, Mary's bright smile, and the hope in all the children's eyes, because, he said simply, "I believe that when we help each other, we make the whole world a little bit brighter." James Miller had planned to stay in Millbrook for only one night, just long enough to rest his horse and get a warm meal. But after meeting Emma and the 5 orphan children, he found himself unable to leave. Every time he thought about riding away, he remembered Emma's pale, tired face and the grateful smiles of the hungry children. He rented a small room at the village and spent his days thinking about what he had witnessed. Emma's incredible sacrifice had moved him deeply. Here was a woman who had nearly starved herself to death to keep 5 children alive, asking for nothing in return. James had never seen such pure, selfless love as the days passed. James realized that his help alone wouldn't be enough. The children needed more than just food and blankets. They needed a real home, proper care, and the support of an entire community. But most of the villagers didn't even know the children existed. On Saturday evening, James made a decision that would change everything. He walked to the small stone church where Reverend Michael Davis was preparing for a Sunday service. James knocked on the wooden door and waited nervously. "Good evening, Reverend," James said when the door opened. "My name is James Miller. I'm a stranger in your town, but I have something important to share with your congregation tomorrow." Reverend Davis was a kind man with gray hair and gentle eyes. He invited James inside and listened carefully as the cowboy told him about Emma and the children. By the end of the story, the Reverend had tears in his eyes. "Of course you must speak tomorrow," Reverend Davis said. "This community needs to hear what you've witnessed." Sunday morning came with bright sunshine that made the snow sparkle like crystals. The small church was packed with villagers. As it always was on Sunday mornings, families sat together in wooden pews. And everyone was curious about the stranger who would be speaking to them. James stood up in front of the congregation, his cowboy hat in his hands. He was nervous because he wasn't used to speaking in front of so many people. But he knew this was important. "Friends," James began, his voice clear and strong, "I came to your village as a stranger just a few days ago, but I discovered something here that has changed my heart forever." He told them about finding Emma collapsed in the snow, about discovering the 5 orphan children in the barn, and about Emma's incredible sacrifice. He described how she had given away her own food, sold her precious belongings, and nearly died trying to keep the children alive. "This woman, Emma Watson, has shown me what true love looks like," James said. "She asked for nothing in return. She simply saw children in need and gave everything she had to help them." As James spoke, he could see the effect his words were having on the congregation. Women wiped tears from their eyes. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, feeling ashamed that they hadn't known about the children's situation. Parents hugged their own children a little tighter. When James finished speaking, the church was completely silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, people began to stand up and speak. Robert Stone, the village baker, was the first to respond. "I'll provide fresh bread for those children every single day," he announced in a loud, clear voice. "No child should go hungry in our village." Margaret Johnson, a motherly woman with a big heart, stood up next. "My husband, Henry, and I have a large house with empty rooms. We would be honored to take 2 of the children into our home. Lucy Brown, the village seamstress, called out from the back of the church. I'll make warm clothes for all of them. No charge, of course. One by one. More villagers stood up to offer help. The blacksmith offered to build beds and furniture. The doctor promised free medical care. Families volunteered to help with cooking, cleaning, and childcare. The response was so overwhelming that Reverend Davis had to ask for quiet so they could organize everything properly. By the end of the service, the entire village had committed to helping Emma and the children. Within just 1 week, amazing things began to happen. The villagers worked together to fix up an old house near the church that had been empty for years. They cleaned it from top to bottom, painted the walls bright colors, and filled it with furniture and warm blankets. James found work at the Miller Ranch just outside of town, the ranch owner. William Miller was impressed by James's character and offered him a permanent job. James decided to stay in Millbrook to help with the children and to be part of this caring community. Emma's health improved quickly once she started eating regular meals again. The dark circles under her eyes disappeared, and color returned too. Her pale cheeks. But more importantly, her heart was filled with joy as she watched the children flourish in their new home. The village officially opened the Millbrook Children's Home 1 month after James's speech at the church. Emma became the supervisor. With help from several volunteer families, the 5 original children were joined by 3 more orphans from nearby towns who heard about the safe, loving place that had been created. One peaceful evening in spring, Emma stood on the front porch of the children's home, watching Thomas teach little Mary how to plant flowers in the garden. Peter and Alice were playing a game with some village children. While baby Ben slept peacefully in his crib, James walked up to join her on the porch. You started something beautiful here, Emma, he said softly. Emma smiled and shook her head. No, James, we all did it together. Sometimes it just takes one person to begin. And then love spreads like ripples in a pond. The Millbrook Children's home became the heart of the village, a place where love grew stronger instead of weaker when it was shared. Emma learned that sometimes when we give everything we have, life gives us back even more than we ever dreamed possible. The end.